Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble.
I'm Chris Clements.
And we are highly honored
Oh, my goodness.
to have Charles W. Cooke from the National Review.
The Honorable.
The Honorable. No, the
Charles,
Right Honorable.
The Right Honorable. Excuse me. The Right Honorable Charles C.W. Cooke.
You know, Rich should have stopped doing that when I became a citizen because I had to abjure all foreign titles of nobility.
That's
Not that I
right.
ever had that one, but
But it makes perfect sense.
yeah.
It makes absolutely perfect sense. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Thanks for being here in our fair state. Hope you're enjoying the heat.
I like heat. I live in Florida, so
Yes.
it's different.
It's a little bit
but
different.
It's still heat.
Heat is heat. Florida's a little moist.
Yeah.
For my taste.
That word.
That was from my brother. He literally gags anytime he hears that word. So.
Yeah. So does my wife.
Yeah.
So great.
Well, there you go, Sasha. Charles, thank you so much for being here. For those of our listeners who don't know, and that's going to be very few, you are a writer with National Review. And tell us about, obviously you're from Great Britain. Tell us about your younger days, but how did you end up at National Review? Because that's a good story.
Yeah. So I was at my parents' house. I used to read National Review on my iPad or whatever I had, and they had an ad for an internship, and I thought I could do that. And so, 2 bottles of wine later with my dad, I wrote them this email saying, I think you should hire me. And then I didn't hear back for a month, and I thought, well, that's a job I'm not getting. Maybe I was too exuberant in my post 2 bottles of wine state. But then a month later, I got an email asking if I could do an interview, and I did an interview. And then they said, would you come be an intern? And I got a visa, and I came over, and I never left.
That's amazing.
Not I'm not an illegal immigrant.
Right. You didn't overstay the visa.
No,
You made it legal.
Right.
And so what year? That was 2000.
It was 2011.
Yeah. That is remarkable. I mean, when you think about how, just the history of National Review itself, William F. Buckley this year is would have been his 100th birthday in November. And we've been talking about him on various podcasts over the last few months, but
Well, because we're National Review nerds.
yeah,
If there's a nerd to be for National Review, you and I would be like the
Yeah.
poster children.
well,
Because we started reading National Review probably like you, like 14.
Right.
And having our parents, shuffle it in our rooms and hiding stacks of them.
right. Well, but the fact that that's where you started as an intern and have just stayed there. One of the things that I like about National Review is that there does tend to be some real longevity. I mean, I feel like people get there and, some come and go, but many, many great writers come and stay. And you're one of them. And one of the things for those listeners who have not read Charles, he is at National Review right now, and this is no offense to anyone else that's there, the closest to William F. Buckley of any of the writers, as far as your writing style, your insights, and your wit. In my opinion, that's really what made Buckley stand apart, was his wit and witticism. So,
Well, thank you. That's kind of you to say. I had never got the chance to meet him because he died 3 years before I came over. I did have a completely false impression of what it would be like in the office because I started reading National Review in about 2004. I started Googling who thinks this, and then National Review would come up. And so I started reading the columnists. But I thought that everyone who wrote there worked in New York in the office that I was going to work in. So I thought it would be, Rich Lowry sitting next to Thomas Sowell, sitting next to Victor Davis Hanson. I thought they were all just there. And of course, that's not how it works. But you're right. The people who do start writing for NR do tend to stay for quite a long time.
And Richard Brookheiser is another one that has been there for forever. Ramesh, excuse me. There's just, it is interesting to have watched the evolution and to see the impact that National Review, we had a dinner last night, and it was almost to a person around the table. I started reading National Review, such and such. A lot of us were teenagers when we started. So not only are there people who go there and write and stay, they're subscribers who subscribe and stay, right? I mean, I think that's part of it.
What was also interesting about the participants last night is the differences of where they are within the conservative movement.
Mhm.
We had some libertarians, we had some MAGA folks, we
Mhm.
had traditional conservatives, and National Review has had, I think it's fair to say, sort of a difficult relationship with the different parts of the conservative movement. And yet, if you read a lot of the authors in National Review today, there is that type of diversity, which I find fascinating. And yet, National Review will get thrown under the bus by the MAGA folks, but then they'll get thrown under the bus by the traditional conservative folks.
Yeah, I mean, my running joke at the moment is, the New York Times election needle they put up on election night, where it says, we need one on every article that shows whether we're sellout rhino squishes or extreme MAGA, because we get accused of that every day from both sides of it. When I was the editor of the website, I would always tell people that, in effect, NR has two mandates, like the Federal Reserve, right? We have a dual mandate. One is to have an editorial line. So we have institutional positions. Most things are open for debate, but there are some elements ideologically that we wouldn't accept or print. So, for example, we're not going to defend communism.
Right.
We're not going to argue that the US Constitution should be abolished. And as a magazine, we're pro-life. So our editorials are going to reflect that. But the second mandate is to have intra-conservative debates. And we do.
Yes.
And this is why it's sometimes irritating when people say National Review thinks. Yes, National Review has institutional positions, but we also have people who have wildly different views on a lot of the really big issues of the day. I mean, one of them, for example, at the moment is Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
We have people who think that we should send all the money and weapons to Ukraine and possibly even send soldiers. And then we have people who think that we should throw up our hands and do nothing about it at all because it's not our fight and we're overextended, and they worry about getting into another world war.
Right.
And both of those people are permitted to argue that with one another. There's no prejudice against them for doing it. Now, our editorial line is somewhere between the two, is more towards the pro-Ukraine side. But those two things can happen at the same time. And that's always been what NR was for. And if you go back to the 50s, you'll see the same dynamic. No one was arguing for communism in the 1950s. But the definition of conservatism was up for grabs for 10, 15, 20 years in the early days. And that was a good thing.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I think Buckley did so well was he, you talk about the Republican Party needing to be a big tent. He made the conservative movement a big tent. And there were times when he had to kick some people out of the tent, the John Birch Society being the most obvious example, because, the radicalism and conspiracy, laden philosophy that they were pushing was damaging to the conservative movement. I mean, he really was, I believe this to my soul, to literally the day he died, he was the caretaker of the conservative movement. And I view National Review as the continuation of being that caretaker, being the guiding light of where conservatism goes institutionally, but has the ability to have the arguments, as you talked about, with, okay, how do we deal with the certain things that come up that maybe we didn't think of before?
Yeah, and I think that trying to distinguish between those can be difficult, but there's a good example of each at the moment. So if you take tariffs, now I'm a free trade guy, but we have writers who are much more friendly toward tariffs. That's something you can debate. That doesn't need caretaking so much as it needs fostering or accommodating. You have rising anti-Semitism. We're not having a debate over that.
Right.
We're not going to have a debate. Is it great to hate Jewish people? So that's an area where National Review, I think, can still come down very hard and say there's just no room for this in our movement. Now, that doesn't mean not criticizing Israel.
Right.
That doesn't mean taking a particular foreign policy position. But there is a movement now on the right that has moved into anti-Semitism. And I think that caretaking role is still there and is still important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you wrote a very interesting article about somebody on the right, Tucker Carlson, a couple weeks ago, sort of in his voice, which I found hilarious.
I mean, the thing about Tucker is that I have wildly divergent views on Tucker, because sometimes I listen to him and I'm like, exactly. And other times I'm like, this guy has lost his mind. And I don't,
Well,
I
I
don't
think
quite
that's
understand.
true for everybody.
Yeah, I suppose, but I don't know. I guess part of it is because I've known Tucker for so long. You know, I knew him when he was, you know, well, I really got to know him best when he started at Daily Caller, and he was as traditionally conservative as I imagine myself and most people in the movement. But boy, he's gone on some weird tangents.
Yeah, I think what frustrates me about him, obviously he's very talented, but I think what frustrates me about him is he treats those who argue with him or in front of him differently depending on whether or not he wants to ridicule or allow their views through. So, for example, when he had Ted Cruz on, he got really pedantic.
Yeah.
You know, so Ted Cruz would say hello, and he'd say, well, what is hello? You know, what is that capital H? What's the O for? Do you know the history of hello? How many times have you said it this morning? And yet he had that guy on who said the greatest villain of World War II was Winston Churchill.
Oh, yeah.
And he didn't say a word. He just let him speak. And I find that
he
irritating.
Nodded. I mean, I was like, I got the impression he was agreeing with him, and I was just we actually talked about
we
this
did.
on the podcast.
We did. We thought that was crazy
because Winston Churchill is one of my heroes, and I was so offended by that episode of his podcast. I was just it was this blasphemy.
But then he'll have, like a couple weeks ago, he had Lee Strobel on, who wrote The Case for Christ. And so then he has this whole exploration of faith where all those podcasts are tremendous.
Yeah.
You know, and Michael Knowles on right after that. That was tremendous. And so you kind of sit back and go, where are you going with this?
Yeah. Well,
So-
and his comments at Charlie Kirk's memorial
Were great.
Great. I mean, it was that was the Tucker that, you know, I kind of remembered from years ago.
Yeah,
So.
they were great. Well, it's just, I mean, and that's, again, that's kind of where the conservative movement is this push-pull, you know, of ideas right now. And I'd like to think that's allowed, that we're big enough to do it and not push each other away because we have divergent views. And what I've been really impressed with National Review is the breadth of opinions on these issues, but the fact that there is a specific line, whether it's anti-Semitism or pro-life or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also a reflection of the right. I think there was a rewriting when Trump came along of the history of the conservative movement from people who didn't like him. Now, I have very mixed feelings about Trump. As you know, I can be very critical of him. But Trump did not invent some of the ideas that he adopted in 2016. You only have to go back to 1992 when Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush to see that they were already within the bloodstream. There was a part of the movement that was much more skeptical of immigration, that was much more skeptical of free trade, and that did not have the same sort of enthusiasm for, say, free markets that I do. Now, historically, that's been 30% maybe of the coalition. And under Trump, it's ticked up. It's probably not 50%, but it's closer to it.
Yeah.
And I think some of the people who are within that quite rightly said of Trump's critics, of which I was one, look, we've been with you when you've put forward your candidates for years. And you've said to us, could you just suck it up and vote for the Republican candidate so we can all win? And now we want you to suck it up and vote for the guy. And some of you are saying, I don't want to be associated with you. So I think that it's not just that NR needs to have these debates because they're interesting or useful, but they're already there. They're already happening. And they have been for really a century. If you look at the evolution of the right, Matt Continetti has a good book about this. These didn't arrive 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, it is so interesting when you think about it, because there was the America First movement that was started, that was pretty prevalent before we went into World War II. I mean, that was the reason, I think, in large part, why FDR was dragging his feet so long to do the Lend-Lease.
Buckley was in that, by the way.
Yeah.
Buckley was opposed to American entry into World War II. Now, he subsequently changed his mind, and I think he was wrong although it was understandable why he didn't want America to get involved. But it wasn't as if Buckley was sitting on the outside of that. He was
Right.
involved in it.
Right. I mean, hosted. As much criticism as, and I'm going to blow who is his biographer, the book that just came out in June.
Oh yeah, that took 27 years to
Ten-
write.
Yeah.
Tannenhouse.
Tannenhouse.
Yeah.
So
That massive volume that's sitting on
Yeah.
my desk.
I
just like,
I've read it,
I
and
haven't
it
read the whole
was
thing yet.
a fascinating read. I mean, one thing I appreciate was that it dove deep in the early days of Buckley. A lot of stuff that I didn't know as much about Buckley. I mean, the last 30 years of his life was like 4 pages.
Yeah, that's
It's
one
kind
of the
of bizarre.
criticisms.
But I think that he was pretty unfair in some ways. But I was able to, because I have such a reverence for Buckley, I can read critical things about him and be fine. I'm not the kind of person that thinks words are violence. So
You don't want to burn down National Review.
no.
right?
No. But the idea that America First was something that Trump came up with is absurd. I mean,
No.
it's just this whole debate, as you point out,
Make
is
America great again. Ronald Reagan.
Ronald
happened
Reagan,
to
right.
say that.
Well, and Senator Taft in Ohio in the 50s thought that Eisenhower was an adventurist. And
Yep.
this was a big point of contention on the right, and it has been since. And we forgot it for a while because the conservative movement united around its opposition to communism. And we won that.
Yeah.
And then we got our own way and the world liberalized, and it looked as if, I'd never thought history was over, but it looked as if communism had been so discredited that those disagreements got tamped down. But over time, you then have new questions to address. What do you do about the Middle East? What do you do in Ukraine? What do you do in South America? And you're going to have divergent opinions on those. As I say, they've always been there. So our role is to debate them, not to suppress them.
Yeah. Now, 2 questions. One is specific about America. One is specific about Britain. Let's start with the UK. How fearful are you of the UK's future?
Speaking of socialism
Yeah.
and anti-Semitism, let's get right to it.
Well, how long have you got? I mean, there's 2 sides of this that are alarming. The first one is Britain seems to have given up on creating wealth.
Oh my.
And
That's a great
you
point.
can't run a country in the long run based on extracting resources from wealth that's already been created. And there's a statistic I saw recently that blew my mind, but that's been borne out anecdotally by people from England who've come over to America in the last 10 years just to visit. And that's that in 2008, the European Union, which at that point included Britain,
Mm-hmm.
and the United States had economies that were the same size. And that in 2025, the American economy is twice the size of the EU economy, even if you include Britain.
Wow.
We have exploded. Now, we have our own problems we can go into with entitlements and debt and never ever balancing a budget or trying to.
Right.
But we are still creating economic growth and activity. And Britain isn't. And they now have the highest tax burden that they've had since World War II. They have more regulation than they've had since the sclerotic days of the 70s. And the Labour Party is making it worse, not better. So I worry a great deal about that, because I think that if you can't fix that problem, everything else is incidental. Then there's the question of free speech. Now, this is a complicated one. Britain does have problems in some regard with immigration and assimilation. But the distinction I would always draw is this. It's not the case that Britain's free speech violations are primarily the result of people moving from other places and then demanding illiberal laws. It's the case that because so many people have moved from other places, white progressives want laws to protect them.
Mm.
So it's not that those people are standing up and saying, hey, we need a First Amendment in Britain, but the British have done this to themselves. I mean, Britain is still 90% white. Compared to the United States, it's just not a very diverse place.
Right.
If there were a majority or a supermajority in Britain that wanted to fix the free speech issues, there's nothing immigrants could do about it. But they don't want to fix it. They passed these laws. They're still happy with these laws. Now, I do think one thing that might change that is, although the British aren't great on free speech and never have been, they really like a sense of fair play. And the way that those laws are being executed now is really unjust. I mean, we saw this with Graham Linehan arriving at the airport and being arrested. Meanwhile, people will go on Twitter and say, I think all conservatives should die, and the police will ignore it.
Right.
That really bothers the British, and I wonder if that's going to lead to some sort of reform rather than this more American, abstract, and commendable commitment to free speech.
Yeah. Interesting. What do you think this big, was it a free speech protest with Tommy Robinson? Is that his
Yeah,
name?
yeah.
Was that as big as what I saw? Wildly different numbers. It was 100,000. It was 3 million. I'm assuming it was somewhere in between, but probably closer to 100,000, right?
I think it was a big deal. I think a bigger deal is that both of the major parties that have dominated British politics in the last 70 years seem to be in second and third place to this new Reform Party, which is more populist. I'm not a populist in a lot of ways, but when it comes to free speech, I think Britain needs some populism.
Yeah.
Because the elites and the technocrats in Britain are just horrible on the question.
Yeah.
And they just need someone. I mean, another good example of where Britain is liable to push back now is they started passing laws that apply to pubs. Now, there's this New Zealand comedian I love.
I read this and
Yeah.
I was like, wait a second. This doesn't make any sense at all.
So there's this guy, I don't know his name, but he's a comedian from New Zealand, and he has this joke where he tries to imagine the news being taken in Ireland when they were told that they would be the first country in Europe to ban smoking in pubs. And he says, us, in pubs, but we live in pubs, right? And I think it's the same thing with this, is like the British will take this only so far.
Only so far.
If you start passing laws that say we can superintend your speech at the bar, and if it makes anyone feel uncomfortable, you've basically abolished jokes.
Yeah.
You've basically said to, especially men, you're not allowed to sit around, have a few beers, and just banter. And that's where that kind of protest and the populism could lead to some good reform.
Interesting. Okay, so the next question is, what is your greatest fear as you look into the future of what is most at risk within the conservative movement?
Well, a couple of things. One is that it fractures. The coalition that Trump presides over is not necessarily logically coherent. And I think that's true on the left as well.
Yeah.
If you look at what is the left at the moment, it's really odd. I mean, you've got African Americans disproportionately. There's been some movement, but still.
Right.
You've got white progressives. You've got unions. And their interests don't really coalesce, but they're still in the coalition. That is less true on the right, but there is still some of it. I mean, if you look at who we have, the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wing of the Democratic Party, which has now moved a bit more towards us, plus business interests, those two things are uneasy.
Right.
Plus younger men, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's bizarre that younger men for a while was so enthusiastic about the modern Democratic Party.
That's
Yeah.
probably accelerating.
Yeah,
We've
I
seen-
think it is.
We've seen that the last several weeks.
Absolutely. And then you have religious people. That makes a lot more sense too, because Republicans are just much better on religious liberty.
Right.
And also, they're not disparaging about people who are religious as a matter of habit, which the left is. But the coalition it's not quite as obviously coherent as it was in the 80s. And so I worry a bit about that. What worry about too is that we will forget what we believe because we are so obsessed with Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, uh, Trump's is obviously an extraordinarily talented politician, and he is the dominant figure of the era. And if you had said that to me in 2015, I'd have thought you were smoking crack. I mean,
Well, we all would have
we all
thought you
thought
were
that.
smoking
Yeah.
crack.
but I mean, just think about the idea that in 20 years' time, Donald Trump is going to have been the seminal figure of this era, and Barack Obama is going to have been a footnote.
That
no,
is a
that is an
phenomenal way
argument
to put
that
it.
your
I mean,
your magazine has been making, and I hadn't really thought about that, because if you turn to the left, and it was really interesting the last couple of weeks, Obama's trying to assert himself in many different ways, but then stepping all over himself at the same time, and I think you're right. I think Trump is this force. He's this force of nature. I think you were saying it's like pixie dust or fairy dust, and he just, everything that he says, people kind of hang on, and he drives the left crazy. He drives people on the right crazy, and the biggest question right now going on is what happens after Trump.
Exactly.
After Trump, and what does that look like? And does the Republican Party become somewhat normal, or does it, or does JD Vance's ascendancy continue, or does it swing back in another direction?
I think that Trump is so influential and so powerful that he is able to bend the party largely to his will. And I think when he's gone, that won't be the case.
But I think it'll continue up until the next election.
Sure.
I think anybody thinking they're going to run against whoever his handpicked successor is and be successful is kidding.
Well, especially if
themselves.
that person
But there are
wins.
people who think that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it might last a little beyond that.
Yeah.
But he is a force of nature. But one problem with that is that you can get sucked up in that and forget what it is that you're trying to achieve. And some of the stuff he does is ridiculous, and some of the things he says is crazy.
right.
And I do worry about that, because I think because he, by the time he leaves, will have been the dominant force in American politics for nearly 15 years, there are a lot of people who will forget what it was they were trying to achieve in the first place. And then there are a lot of younger people who will never have seen anything else.
Right.
I mean, my recollection of America is pre-Trump, and a 20-year-old is not. I mean, my kids are 7 and 9. They don't know anything about politics, but they love Trump because he's on TV and he's funny. And to them, that is America and American politics. And they know he's the president. They know he's been president twice. And they know that Joe Biden was old and that he had a terrible debate. And, well, because they sort of pick up little bits here and there. But to them, they don't know who Barack Obama is. They don't know who George W. Bush is. They don't know who Ronald Reagan is. So this is politics to them. And that's going to change our politics unless there's some sort of snapback to normality. But then there's the first point, which is what is that and who decides and how does the coalition hold together?
That's such a great point, because, I mean, when you think about what is kind of the traditional conservative Republican positions, certainly, first and foremost, it was big government sucks. So fiscal responsibility.
Right.
And we have completely abandoned that.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump early on, both the first time he ran and then again in this 2024 election and in the primaries, he laid down a marker that said Social Security, Medicare discussion, reform off the table. He's just not going to do it. And that immediately shut down the debate on our side. But you can't have a debate about fiscal reform without talking about those things, because those are 80%, 90% of the problem. So that part worries me, because you have so many working class people that are a part of the coalition who are driven by Trump, who don't give a rip about budgetary issues. And when he's gone, are they going to figure it out? How do we educate our coalition on the true danger of what we're facing once Trump is gone?
I think the problem is the conflation of the political tactic you described and reality. And I noted this in 2016. There was a piece in the New York Times just before the election that effectively said both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have worked out that Americans don't want to hear about the entitlements crisis and that it's bad for them politically if they bring it up. True. Undoubtedly true.
Undoubtedly.
The next bit was white space, right? Like, okay, but couldn't we all acknowledge that it's still there?
It's still there.
I mean, it's like saying there's a dinosaur over there and I don't want to tell my kids because they'll be scared. Okay, but it's still there. Like, it's still right there.
There's a shark in the water.
Yeah.
And I know you're all swimming, but we'll play like it
I don't want to
doesn't
cause a
exist.
panic.
I don't want to cause a panic.
But it's still
Exactly.
there. And that's the bit that worries me because the Times seemed to think that was the end of the story. Like, well, they've both worked out that it's very unpopular to say that we're heading towards fiscal disaster. So I guess that's politics now. But well, it is politics now, but it's not reality now.
Right.
And I don't know the answer. I think the calculation that both parties have made is that someone else will be in office when it happens. I mean, as far as I understand it, in the 2030s, on our current trajectory, there will be automatic cuts to Social Security.
Yep.
And obviously, Congress is going to step in and try to stop most of them. But that's a problem for a different president and a different Congress.
Yeah.
And I think both parties have just decided that that's how to deal with it. And they're not going to educate anyone about it because it doesn't help them in the immediate term.
Well,
is-
we heard a lot about it last night, right? I mean, this whole idea that Congress exists just to get elected.
Yeah.
And the Congress itself exists just to coalesce power and to continue to win elections
Well, and
and
I
to
think-
raise money.
And I think one of the problems is that, because I was on the Hill for 14 years, and we talked about, we actually, after the 2004 election, we actually tried to do some Social Security
Right.
reform, and it just became a complete disaster. And to Bush's credit, he tried. And had we put in the ability for people to take a portion of their Social Security benefits and put them in the market, we would be way ahead.
We wouldn't be having
We
this
wouldn't be
debate.
having the discussion.
No.
I think part of the problem was that back then we were talking about the 2030s, and that just felt like a lifetime
Mm-hmm.
away. It even feels like it's a long ways away now, but it's
so
not.
much.
It's less than 10 years. I mean, we're 5 years away from 2030. And so it has been true, I think, that President, once that happened to Bush, it was never talked about again, right, at the presidential level. And at the congressional level, there's been a few people, David Schweikert's one of them, who have said, look, we've got to have this discussion, guys, but nobody wants to have it because most of them know they're not going to be in Congress in the 2030s. And so you're right. It's just it's literally the definition of kicking the can down the road.
I will say, just as an addendum, because I was critical of Trump on this, I do think that the primary villains here come from the left, and I'll explain why. First off, if any Republican talks about this, even very responsibly, or in a way that makes it abundantly clear that all they want to do is, for example, raise the age by a small amount for people in 20 years, the left runs ads against them saying you're trying to kill grandma.
Right.
And that makes us stupid as a culture. And I understand why Republicans looked at this and said, I'm just not touching this because Barack Obama did this really effectively to Mitt Romney and won because of it. I also think that it matters that there's one party that is irresponsible on this, that's Republicans, and then there's one party that is insane on this, and that's the Democrats who have run the last 3 times talking about increasing Social Security benefits. Now, with the bill that just went through Congress, effectively Republicans did increase Social Security benefits by removing some taxes on people who receive it. That's mathematically identical.
Yeah.
So Republicans don't have their hands clean.
Right.
But Hillary Clinton's view was that we should lower the retirement age to 60.
Yeah.
I mean, how could you possibly look at this? I understand if you just say, leave it, I don't want to touch it. I can understand that. But saying reduce the age?
Let's make it worse.
Yeah. So if in that circumstance, the sort of responsible conservative elder statesman's the guy who says, no, leave it as it is.
Right.
So I don't want to make it seem as if Trump is the main villain here. I just do think that at some point it's going to have to be the adults in the room who say, all right, we have to touch this, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes an overall arching, bipartisan, even though I hate to use that word, but it becomes both their problems.
I mean,
And that cliff is going to come sooner than later. And
given
then
that I have never
bigger.
believed, I literally have never believed that Social Security would be there when I retire. And I'm actually a lot closer to retirement now than I was
you
before. Yeah. I would
We are
be
the older statesmen.
perfectly happy if they raised the retirement age on my generation.
Right.
I mean,
we were perfectly happy with everything they were proposing back in 2003 and 2004.
Yeah.
Perfectly happy with all that.
And
Because it would
since-
affect us at that time.
right. And given that it's probably too late to fix it with the personal accounts, we probably ought to do that anyway for future. But I mean, it's retirement age 65, right? So I'm
Yeah.
10 years away.
Are you really?
Yeah, you're closer.
I know.
But I'm saying make it 68. I don't care. I mean, at this point, I'm going to have to work that long anyway.
Yeah.
So why not?
But I mean, there's sensible ways of fixing it. We've David was here a couple weeks ago and he had all his charts and he had everything that he showed our listeners and our viewers. But nobody has the political will or the intellectual honesty to move forward. And that's the sad thing about our politics.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. What so let's talk about we've talked about the challenges to the conservative movement. You have some views on challenges to the left.
Mm-hmm.
What are they? What's the future look like for the Democrats?
The problem the left has at the moment, the primary problem that they have, is that they have tried over and over again to remove most of the issues that people care about from politics. And by that I mean they've tried to turn them into moral imperatives that can't be compromised. But you can't do that on most things. Now, America's admirable in that we do set some things aside from politics. Not completely aside, but we make some things much more difficult to touch. So the First Amendment. You could repeal it with an Article 5 process, but you can't just come into office and with a simple majority get rid of it. The right to trial by jury is another good example of this. The fact that we have elections every 4 years. But most things require a compromise, especially in a divided country. And so immigration is a good example of this, is a question that is open. Should we have new people coming into the country and under what rules? Should we have more people coming in through chain migration or family reunification than we do through skills? Should we increase the number of skilled people? What skills do we want them to have? Do we want them to speak English? Do we want them to come from certain places? How should we deal with people who break into the country and come here illegally? Should we deport them? Should we have more asylum spots? These are all questions that you can have left-wing views or right-wing views on, but that are going to ultimately be resolved either in Congress or through prosecutorial discretion from the presidency. But the left has, and I don't mean all Democrats, I mean the left, has tried to set this apart. They've come to the view that all enforcement is intrinsically wrong or evil or even fascist. And that's why even ICE agents who are deporting criminals who are here illegally are being called Nazis out in California and elsewhere. And when you do that, you make it impossible to align yourself with the electorate, even when that electorate is moderate. And I think that the same is true on, for example, a lot of transgender issues. I think the same is true on spending, especially in, say, education, where there is this idea now that the state essentially owns your kids, gets to decide what they learn because you're unqualified, that homeschooling should be banned, that charter schools take money away from teachers' unions, and that anyone who wants to get involved, whether it's via a school board or via a curriculum, is sort of impinging upon the God-given right of the teachers' unions to teach your kids. And again, that's just unviable. It's not that I expect everyone to agree with me as a conservative. Of course I don't. But I mean, I'll give you a good example of it. In Florida, we have laws that prevent schools from showing books to children that are inappropriate for their age. Now, if you look through what has been included in what progressives call book bans, they are mostly pornographic books.
Right. Yeah.
And you can tell that this is true because in a brilliant move, Governor DeSantis held them up at a press conference in front of the cameras, and the networks had to cut away because they were scared of being fined by the FCC, right? So the school boards have made decisions based on this law. Now, occasionally I think they got it wrong, but mostly they've got it right. That is a democratic process, small d democratic process, that we run for school board, make your case, get the parents on board order. Run for the legislature, change the law. Run for governor, change the bureaucratic implementation. But they see it as this is fascism, it's a book ban. Nothing can be removed from the curriculum, which I think strikes people as crazy. And I think that's their biggest problem, because it's only about 20% of their movement that has picked up all these extreme positions, but they're the ones running everything.
Yeah.
And also, they have built in the media this suicide machine that will enforce these ideas at their expense. And, now you will not find someone in the New York Times who writes an op-ed saying, actually, Florida's system is kind of sensible. And so there's no feedback mechanism to fix it.
Yeah. They've literally pushed everyone out that has an opposing view.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, we worry about the echo chamber of conservatism, but we don't have it. It's nearly not as bad. We're not nearly as bad as what's going on the hard left, for sure. And you're right that, I mean, one of the differences is that the hard left does dictate the whole entirety of the Democratic Party right now.
And to your point, they keep investing, and we've said it on the show several times, these 80-20 issues.
Mm-hmm.
And they keep doubling down on these 80-20 issues. When we were walking in, I said we have this term, Bud Light has become a verb. They keep Bud Lighting themselves on fire. We saw this week with the whole Jimmy Kimmel thing. And now he's coming back this afternoon. And that's going to have major consequences and that major debate. And there's so many people who are against something like that. And yet they believe in their heart of hearts that this is the right thing, whether it's pornographic books in schools or some comedian, throwing a dead man under the bus.
It's just a misapplication of an instinct that is actually fine to all of politics. So a good example would be, suppose that someone said we should bring back slavery, right? None of us would say, okay, how many? Right. We would say that's not a question for political debate. That is a no. And if you saw it start to happen, you would start to go outside of the political channels. And I hope you would start to see states seceding and probably people rising up and saying, you're just not doing that in my country. That is a good thing. I'm glad that that's how Americans think. It's just that is an extreme example that you cannot apply to most things.
Right.
But if you listen to progressives now talk about almost anything that Donald Trump does, it's cast exactly like that.
Such a great
And you
point.
can't recover from that politically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's almost as if I'm trying to phrase this the right way, but I think what you just said is kind of where the left has gone with this whole idea of, men playing in women's sports.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we must let this happen. This must happen. And they are fully into it. And the rest of the country, it's like 90% saying, you're all crazy. This is nuts. And this is not only sexist, it's racist. You can put every ist into that. And yet they keep doubling down.
And it's especially weird, that one, because until about 3 minutes ago, the notion that you would put a man in a woman's space, or you would put a man in a boxing ring with a woman, would have been extremely offensive to them. I mean, I'm fascinated by this with J.K. Rowling, who they did a podcast
a
at
woman
the Free
of the
Press.
left, really?
Yeah, I don't know if you heard this, the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling on the Free Press.
Absolutely must.
And they sat
listen.
her down for hours, and she talked, and she ran through the history of rape crisis centers in Britain. Now, before the 50s, there were no rape crisis centers in Britain. Didn't have any. And a lot of women suffered from it. They didn't have somewhere they could go where you didn't have men around. And they slowly built these up. And this was a great achievement of the feminist movement that was referred to as a great achievement of the feminist movement until about 5 years ago, at which point people started to say, well, if somebody says that they're a woman, then they can go into the Rape Crisis Center for Abused Women. Now, I don't know how that became the woke or kind or left position. To me, it's very obvious that what you're doing there is you're reversing all of that progress that progressives were quite rightly proud of. I can't see how that's happened.
Yeah, it is. It
makes no sense
It
at all.
is the most eponymous. I mean, it is one of those fascinating questions that is such a mystery that you'd have the same liberal white women who were the leaders of the feminist movement become the leaders of putting men back into their space.
Right.
I mean, it is just baffling. It
I'm
just makes
baffled.
no sense. Someone ought to do a psychology experiment on that or something.
I don't know. I'm glad. I'm really happy that the pendulum, whatever this pendulum was, is now swinging back into the area of common sense and reality, and not fantasy.
Yeah, I mean it's not over, but it's definitely, I think.
Well, I think parents
Going.
now are feeling more bold to stand up and speak out and say, no, this is not happening. And athletes too, to their credit. No, we're not playing against you. Thank you. We'll forfeit.
It's also, you can't interact with the fundamental claim that is made and keep a straight face. I mean, I think so. I have always been fine with gay marriage, and I was always very much in favor of religious liberty as well. I don't think one leads to the reduction of the other, but I wrote a book 10 years ago, and that was one of the arguments I made. I said, I don't think this is going to be important in a decade. I got that right. There's a lot in the book that was wrong, but I got that right. But I think that's because when most people who don't want to talk about politics in the first place, and they certainly don't want to get into arguments, are asked, okay, so two men get married, why do you care? They're hard-pressed to find an answer to that motivates them. But if you say, do you know there's no scientific evidence that there is a difference between men and women's strength, which is the claim that is made, I think your average soccer mom just says, sorry, what? I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say. You don't have to be in the slightest bit disparaging of transgender people to know that that isn't true.
Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, that a lot of our laws and societal presumptions are based on the idea that men and women are of different strengths on average. Now, yes, of course, there are very weak men and very strong women, but on average, that is a big reason that we have set our society up in the way we did. And you can't just say, oh, okay, then. But the thing is that progressives have tried to treat those two things as if they're the same. They moved from one to the other, and they thought, well, if we just say it enough, then people will go with it. But it's silly, because it obviously matters in a way that gay marriage didn't to the average person.
Yeah, such a great point. Such a great point. Charles, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. How can people reach you, read you, listen to you? You've got a lot of places that you...
Sure. Well, National Review, obviously. And then I'm on Twitter at Charles C.W. Cooke. That's Cooke with an E. And I also have a podcast, the Charles C.W. Cooke Podcast. It's a very creative name. And then I'm on a podcast, a National Review, called The Editors, twice a week.
Excellent.
Excellent podcast. Just great.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you
thank you.
again for being here.
My
People,
pleasure.
read this man. Listen to this man. He is,
And
words of
you
wisdom.
and you're on the Megan Kelly show.
That's
every
true.
once in a while.
Yeah,
And those are the best episodes with
Thank
you and
you.
Rich. They really are. No, I really think but the best episodes are when you guys are on, maybe one of the Ruthless guys are on, but it's because you're elevating conservatism in a way that
the
it
intellectual
doesn't
discussion.
I think get elevated enough
Yeah.
in a broader audience. So I think it's great.
Yeah, it's a fun show to do.
Good. Well, thank you again.
Thanks
All
for
right.
having me.
God
Thanks,
bless.
everybody. Take care.